Have you ever kept a family secret for decades? I won't ask what, just curious.
I stood at the edge of the gallery floor, heart pounding like I'd swallowed a damn drum, fingers twitching around the edge of the speech I had printed the night before, just in case I lost my nerve, though truthfully, I already knew I wouldn't. Not after everything it took to get here. Not after all the nights I cried alone in that studio, scraping paint off canvases with a credit card because I couldn't afford a proper palette knife. Not after eating cantuna 3 days in a row so I could buy stretcher bars instead of groceries. Not after all those years of being told, by the people who were supposed to love me the most, that art was just a hobby, that I needed to grow up, get real, stop being dramatic, stop wasting time, stop pretending like anything I created could ever matter. And yet, here I was. 42 years old. 2 decades of working meaningless day jobs to keep the lights on, slowly carving out moments in between spreadsheets and service shifts to paint the pictures that filled my head like static, never quite gone, never quiet. Somehow, despite all odds and opinions, I had gotten to this night, my first solo exhibit, Unspoken Rooms. The lights were low, the wine was flowing, and my work was finally hanging on whitewashed walls instead of leaning against the dusty corners of my apartment. Friends came. Colleagues came. Even my old high school art teacher drove in from Houston to see it. But as I stood there, scanning the room, the faces I had secretly been waiting to see weren't there. No Amy, my older sister with her endless judgments and pursed-lipped disapproval, who once told me that painting was fine, but real women contribute to society. No Greg, the cousin who practically lived in my apartment after his second divorce and only left when I stopped paying for his cigarettes. Not even my mother, who had the audacity to ask me last month if this show was one of those little community things at the library, as if I hadn't sent her the press release and the event page 3 times. Not one person from my family had shown up. It wasn't just the absence. It was the silence. No, good luck, no, sorry we can't make it, not even a phony, break a leg. The day before the show, I sent a group text. I invited them all. I reminded them gently, attached directions, added that there would be wine and food and God help me, even a jazz quartet. Still nothing. So I stood there, in heels that made my toes scream, on the edge of the one night that I had spent my entire adult life crawling toward, and I realized something terrifying and crystal clear. They were never coming. Not because they forgot, or because they were busy, or because of traffic. No. They didn't come because they never believed I'd make it this far, and now that I had, they couldn't stand to see it. The event manager tapped the mic twice, smiled at me from the podium like he had no idea I was fighting the urge to bolt straight out the back door. And now, the woman behind the work, Samantha Reynolds, he said, stepping aside. I didn't think. I walked forward. The applause was warm. Real. Kind faces. People who had made time. Strangers who had followed my journey online. A woman from Dallas who told me through tears earlier that one of my pieces reminded her of the last conversation she had with her sister before she passed. And yet, all I could feel was the gnawing void of those empty seats. I took a deep breath, unfolded the paper I'd rehearsed in my bedroom mirror 100 times, and then decided to hell with it. I spoke from the gut. I was going to read something formal, I said, something about gratitude, about dreams, about finally seeing yourself reflected back through the work you put into the world. But honestly, tonight deserves something more honest than that. I could feel the silence grow stiller, thicker. Everyone in this room showed up. And I don't just mean physically. You showed up emotionally. You believed. You gave me your time, your words, your faith, and for that, I will never forget you. This is for you. All of it. I paused. The paper in my hand shook. I didn't look at it again. But to those who couldn't be bothered to show up tonight, to those who ignored the invitations, the reminders, the years I've spent clawing my way to this moment, please, and I say this with no anger, just clarity, stay that way. Stay gone. I've learned how to stand in rooms alone. I've learned how to light up a space without needing your flashlight. If you couldn't make the effort now, when it finally mattered, don't bother trying to stumble in later and act like you care. I won't buy it. And I don't need it. I stepped away from the podium. There was a strange moment, a held breath, and then, unexpectedly, applause. Not polite. Not forced. Real. I smiled, thanked them again, and tried not to cry. People came up afterward, complimented the speech, the paintings, even the color of my dress. I sipped my wine and floated through the evening like a woman finally coming up for air after years of drowning in shallow water. And then I went home. Alone. That's when it started. The moment I closed the door behind me, kicked off those heels, and slumped onto the couch, my phone buzzed. Then again. Then again. I looked at the screen. 22 missed calls. 12 voicemails. A stream of messages that seemed to multiply by the second. From Amy, "I can't believe you would humiliate us like that. What the hell is wrong with you?" From Greg, "Was that supposed to be about me? Grow up." From Mom, "I was too tired to come. You know I've had swelling in my ankles. We watched the video online. Isn't that enough?" And then, from a number I hadn't seen in years, Mark. My brother. Just 3 words, "Call me Sam." The phone slipped from my hand. I stared at the ceiling. Not in triumph, not in pain, something heavier. The thing no one talks about when you finally stand up for yourself. It feels powerful. But it also feels like burning a bridge with no map of where you're headed next. That night, the line between revenge and freedom blurred, and I wasn't sure which side I wanted to be on. And honestly, I still don't know. When I woke up the next morning, sunlight was already pouring through the blinds like it was trying to expose every single thing I had said the night before. As if light alone could make me second-guess what had come out of my mouth in front of that gallery full of strangers, friends, artists, critics, and one very attentive jazz musician who later DM'd me asking for drinks. Sometime this week if you're not too famous already. My phone, still lying face down on the couch where I'd dropped it the night before, was buzzing again, half dead but still hanging on. As if determined to make sure I didn't miss 1 ounce of guilt or performative outrage from the people who had chosen silence until they realized they'd been called out publicly. I sat up slowly, groggy, my mouth dry from a mix of 2 glasses of wine and adrenaline that had fermented overnight into something bitter in the back of my throat. I reached for the phone, half expecting it to be some cruel joke, a dream, or some kind of divine test, but no, the missed calls were real, the texts still glowing on the screen like little emotional landmines just waiting to go off when I stepped on the wrong one. The first one I opened was from Amy, my older sister, who had always been the golden one, the firstborn, the responsible one, the loudest one. The one who got straight A's and then married an accountant named Bryce who wore loafers and corrected your grammar mid-sentence. Her message read, "I can't believe you would humiliate us like that. What the hell is wrong with you?" As if me finally standing up and acknowledging their absence publicly was somehow more offensive than 2 decades of indifference, passive insults, and weaponized silence. There was no, "I'm sorry, no, I regret missing it," not even a half-hearted excuse about traffic or Bryce's back problems. Just pure offense that I hadn't protected their egos while bleeding my heart out on a canvas for years. Next came Greg's message, which was so on brand I could have laughed if it didn't make me want to scream. Was that supposed to be about me? Grow up. That was it. No greeting. No signature. Just a classic deflect and insult wrapped up in a 6-word gaslight special. Greg, who once borrowed $2,000 from me to get back on his feet after his second divorce, and then posted a picture of his new motorcycle 3 weeks later. Greg, who I'd taken in during his worst months, fed, covered for, defended to our aunt when he missed Christmas again. And he wanted to know if it was about him? He already knew the answer, he just didn't want to sit with it. And then came the voicemail from Mom, which I didn't want to listen to but did anyway because I'm human and deep down I still crave even a sliver of warmth from that woman, even though every interaction leaves me either emotionally scraped raw or boiling with rage. Her voice was tired. She always sounded tired when guilt-tripping. "Samantha, I was too tired to come. You know I've had swelling in my ankles again, and I didn't sleep well the night before. We watched the video online. Bryce sent the link. Isn't that enough? You didn't have to embarrass everyone like that." People called me Samantha. Friends. From church. They asked why my own daughter would say something like that in public. "Do you understand what you've done?" That last sentence hung in my ears for a long time, not because of the words themselves, but because of how familiar they sounded. Do you understand what you've done? The same phrase she used when I moved out at 19 to chase an art degree she refused to help pay for. The same phrase she used when I cut contact with my father during his drunk spiral, and she blamed me for giving up on him. It was her favorite line. Not, "How are you?" Not, "What happened?" Just, "Do you understand what you've done?" As if life was some courtroom drama and I was always standing trial. But the last message, the one that really cracked something inside me, came from a number I hadn't seen in years. My brother, Mark. We were close once, when we were kids, back before the divorce, before Dad's slow descent into bitterness, before life cracked us open and poured guilt down into all the cracks. Mark had been my shadow, following me around the house, the yard, even sneaking into my room when the yelling downstairs got too loud. But after Dad died, he pulled away. Moved to Colorado. Barely returned a call. At the funeral, he stood on the opposite side of the casket like I was some kind of stranger, and when I hugged him, he felt stiff, like the grief had calcified into resentment. His text was simple. "Call me Sam." No punctuation. No explanation. I didn't call him. Instead, I opened a new canvas. I painted all day. Didn't eat. Didn't speak. Didn't turn on music or answer a single phone call. I just painted a giant, angry, swirling piece that looked like a storm cloud crashing into a birthday cake. I called it expectation management. By sunset, I sat back, covered in dried paint and sweat, and I knew what I had to do. Amy wanted to talk? Fine. Let her. But not over brunch or coffee or some hollow phone call where she could feed me lines while folding laundry and muting her mic. If she wanted a real conversation, it would happen where I live now in my world. In my space. So I sent her a text that read, "If you'd like to talk, come to the next showing. Front row. You won't miss it." No smiley face. No punctuation. Just the offer. An invitation wrapped in a dare. She replied within 5 minutes. Fine. And, just like that, the game began. I called Tasha, my best friend and the only person who had earned the right to hear the full spectrum of my rage without flinching. "We're doing another show," I said, already planning the layout in my head. "But this time, it's personal." She laughed in that sharp, wicked way of hers. "What are we calling it?" I grinned. "Still working on that. But I know what the centerpiece is going to be." The painting came together fast, too fast. Like it had been sitting under my skin for years, just waiting for permission. A throne made of gold, tilted just slightly, precariously, surrounded by mirrors, each one reflecting a different version of the same woman. Happy, furious, indifferent, exhausted. But none of the faces were smiling. I called it the Martyr Sister, always right, never happy. I booked the space, set the date, designed the flyers. I didn't promote it online. I didn't send it to critics. This one wasn't for the public. It was for me. For her. For them. And when the night came, I wore black, not out of mourning, but because there's nothing more dangerous than a woman who finally understands that she doesn't need to be liked to be powerful. I stood at the entrance of the gallery, arms folded, watching the door. And right on time, Amy walked in. She looked around, blinking like she didn't understand what she had walked into. But oh, she would. And by the time she left, she'd never look at herself the same way again. The room was lit with the kind of cold, clear light that made everything appear sharper than it really was, a stark contrast to the warmth of the first exhibit, which had been all soft hues, ambient jazz, and wine-soaked conversations. This second show, intentionally unannounced to the public and curated solely for the few people who needed to see it, was quieter, leaner, and far more intimate, like a confrontation disguised as a celebration. The kind of night where the walls speak louder than the guests, and every stroke of paint holds a story sharpened into a blade. The gallery wasn't crowded, but that was the point. No fanfare. No press. Just the people I invited personally, and even then, only those who either stood by me during the silent years or now suddenly decided I was worth acknowledging, which in my world, after everything, was not something I gave away freely anymore. There was no guest list at the door, just a sense of unease hanging in the air, the way it does before a thunderstorm, when the sky hasn't cracked yet, but the pressure has already started squeezing behind your eyes. And standing in the middle of that slowly forming storm was Amy. She arrived in a beige coat, too pristine for the Texas heat, lips drawn tight into a line that looked like she'd practiced it in the mirror before coming, trying to look composed, but not affected, aloof but not rude. Her usual tightrope between superiority and plausible deniability. She didn't greet anyone. Didn't look at me, not at first. She walked the gallery like it was a courtroom, and she was waiting to spot the exhibit that would serve as her cross-examination. I didn't approach her. I stood back, arms crossed, letting her take it all in. She saw it before she even reached the end of the corridor, and the change in her posture was immediate, one of those micro-reactions most people wouldn't notice, a tightening of the shoulders, a subtle intake of breath. Her steps slowing just slightly as her eyes locked on the painting that had been designed, down to its very frame, to hold up a mirror she had spent decades avoiding. The Martyr Sister, always right, never happy. That was the title on the placard next to it, printed clearly in stark black serif. No flourish. No explanation. The image, nearly 4 feet tall, showed a throne constructed from glinting golden rods, too narrow to sit on comfortably, tilted to the right just enough to suggest instability. The woman on the throne had Amy's high cheekbones and her rigid posture, though her face was fractured across 5 mirror panels set into the canvas itself, each showing a slightly altered expression, one smiling, one weeping, one furious, one blank, and one looking directly at the viewer with a kind of deep, penetrating judgment. Around her feet were small offerings, baby bottles, textbooks, unpaid bills, a cracked cell phone, symbols of all the things she'd weaponized over the years as reasons she couldn't show up for anyone else. It was not a cruel painting, not an ugly one. But it was honest, painfully so, and that's what made it dangerous. Amy stood in front of it for a long time, too long. People walked around her, whispering, uncertain whether they should look or look away. I watched her jaw clench once, then again, before she finally turned and looked directly at me across the room. Her expression was unreadable, a mix of confusion and indignation, like she couldn't decide if she wanted to confront me or disappear into the floor. But then she did something I didn't expect. She stayed. She didn't leave, didn't storm out, not yet. Instead, she stood at the back of the room as I stepped onto the small platform we had set up for the artist's remarks, the same kind of speech people expected to be a list of inspirations and polite thank yous, and once again, I decided not to give them that. I didn't read from a card this time. I spoke straight from the place that had been fermenting truth since the night of the first exhibit, from the bone-deep certainty that comes only after you finally give yourself permission to stop asking for love that comes with conditions. I want to talk about ghosts, I said, letting my voice ring clearly in the quiet. Not the ones that haunt houses, or the ones we imagine in graveyards, but the ones that live inside us, wearing our memories like second skin. The ghosts of who we were supposed to be, who our families wanted us to become, and who we had to kill off in order to survive. A few people shifted, clearly unsure where this was going, but Amy stood still, frozen in place. For years, I continued, I tried to become a version of myself that was acceptable, palatable, small enough to not cause offense, but still useful enough to keep around. I was told not to be dramatic, not to be selfish, not to make a fuss. I was told that art wasn't real work, that my dreams were a phase, that adulthood meant sacrifice, specifically, sacrificing the parts of yourself that make you feel alive. I scanned the crowd, knowing I was walking a razor's edge, but knowing even more clearly that this was the only path forward. I made those sacrifices. For a while. But I'm not sorry anymore. And here's why, because guilt is the favorite weapon of the coward. It's used to keep people in place, to hold them hostage in family roles they never asked for, to make them feel small when they choose growth, to shame them when they choose themselves. There were murmurs now. I didn't stop. This exhibit isn't an attack. It's a mirror. If you look at the work and see yourself, ask why. If it angers you, ask what that says about the parts of you you don't want others to see. But do not, under any circumstances, confuse honesty with cruelty. I stopped protecting people's feelings at the expense of my own peace. I won't apologize for that. And then I ended it, just like that, without fanfare, without applause cues, without a bow. Just a quiet, firm exit from the stage and back into the audience where I belonged. Some people clapped, awkwardly at first, then more earnestly, and I nodded politely, though all I cared about was Amy, who by now had made her way back toward the front of the gallery and was standing in front of me like a storm cloud that had forgotten whether it wanted to rain or strike. She didn't speak at first. She looked at me, looked at the painting, then back at me again. Her lips parted, but no words came. And then, with a sharp, brittle laugh, she whispered, "You think you're better than all of us now?" I didn't answer. I didn't need to. Because the thing about ghosts is, they can't hurt you if you stop pretending they're real. Amy left shortly after that, her heels echoing across the gallery floor like a ticking clock winding down. I didn't follow. I had nothing left to say. That night, after the guests were gone and the gallery had gone still again, I sat in the middle of the room and listened to the quiet. Not the silence of abandonment, but the peace of a storm past. And just as I closed my eyes, breathing in the leftover scent of oil paint and expensive wine, my phone buzzed again, just once this time. It was Greg. The message read, "Can we talk?" I stared at it, letting the question hang there. Then I typed one sentence. "You can talk, but only if you admit what you did." And I waited. Because this time, I wasn't playing the role of the peacemaker anymore. This time, the gallery was mine. And every ghost that walked through it would have to answer for something. There are moments in life when you begin to see things with a clarity so sharp it almost feels like pain, as though your mind, once fogged by years of compromise, people-pleasing, and emotional exhaustion, finally rips the curtains wide open and lets the light burn through every illusion you clung to for comfort. That moment had arrived for me like a freight train, loud, irreversible, and entirely devoid of subtlety, and with it came a newfound appetite not for revenge in the cinematic sense, but for something deeper and far more potent: reclamation. I didn't want apologies anymore, and I wasn't looking for reconciliation dressed up in polite texts and half-hearted calls. What I wanted was ownership of my voice, my truth, my narrative, and, most importantly, my anger, which I had been told to swallow for far too long in the name of family unity. So when Greg finally messaged me, days after Amy's theatrical exit from the second gallery, asking if we could talk, I didn't respond right away, not because I didn't know what to say, but because I wanted him to feel what I had felt so many times before. Waiting, wondering, stewing in uncertainty while someone else held the emotional cards. I let 2 days pass before replying, and when I did, it was with the simple, deliberate sentence, "You can talk, but only if you admit what you did." It was a sentence designed not as a trap, but as a test. And when he replied with, "Fine, I'll come clean," I didn't feel relief, not even satisfaction. I felt resolve. We met at the same gallery I'd used for the previous shows, although this time, there were no lights, no music, and no audience, just me, Greg, and the echoes of the choices we'd made. He walked in with that same faux casual energy he always carried, like a man who had spent his entire adult life skating by on charm, luck, and the generosity of people he assumed would always forgive him because, deep down, they didn't want to be the bad guy. But what he hadn't accounted for was the fact that I no longer cared whether I was perceived as the villain in his story. We didn't sit. I didn't offer coffee. I didn't ask how he was. Instead, I stood beside the covered painting I had prepared specifically for this moment and said, "Start talking." And to his credit, maybe because he sensed the gravity of what this was, he didn't dance around it. He didn't offer excuses or pretend to be confused. He looked me in the eye and admitted, in the same lazy tone he probably used to order takeout, that yes, he'd taken the money from me years ago under the pretense of paying off a legal fee, and no, he never intended to pay it back. He said he thought I wouldn't miss it, that I was doing okay, and besides, he was family, and isn't that what families for helping each other out? The words came out of his mouth so effortlessly, so devoid of actual remorse, that I felt something inside me snap, not violently, not with rage, but with something colder and far more final, indifference. I didn't answer him. Instead, I pulled the cloth from the painting beside me and let the truth hang in the air like a bell ringing after a long silence. The piece was called The Borrower, and it was as blunt as it was surgical. The canvas was textured with layers of torn-up checks, scanned credit card bills, and painted-over loan agreements, all embedded beneath a portrait of a faceless man holding a mirror to his own reflection, but instead of seeing himself, the mirror showed a pile of IOUs catching fire in his hands. It wasn't about humiliation, it was about exposure. It was a statement, a portrait of what it feels like to be used and then erased. Greg stared at it for a long time, longer than I expected, and for once, he didn't make a joke or shrug it off. "You really did this?" he asked, his voice quieter now, more real. "I lived this," I replied. He nodded, and for a split second, I saw a flicker of understanding in his face, whether it was shame or just the recognition that he no longer held the upper hand. I couldn't say, but it passed, and he turned away without another word, walking out of the gallery like a man realizing too late that the bridge he used to walk across had been replaced with a drawbridge, and I was the one holding the lever. Later that evening, as I stood alone in the now empty space, the air thick with the kind of emotional dust that doesn't settle easily, I got a call from a number I hadn't seen in years. At first, I ignored it, assuming it was some stray critic or another family member ready to lob their opinions into the fire. But then it rang again. And again. Finally, I picked up. It was my mother. Her voice was small, brittle, the sound of someone who had been crying not for hours but days. Her composure cracked in a way I had never heard before. "Samantha," she said, I saw the photos from your last show. People sent them to me. People from church. From my bridge group. From Dad's old coworkers. They said it was powerful and raw, and that you looked happy. They asked why I wasn't there. I didn't speak. I let her talk, because sometimes silence is the only form of self-defense that doesn't require raising your voice. "I don't know what to say," she continued. "I wasn't a good mother to you. I didn't believe in your art. I didn't think it would lead anywhere, and maybe that was me trying to protect you. Or maybe I just didn't understand it, and I was scared. But now I'm scared I lost you." Still, I said nothing, not out of cruelty, but because I had spent a lifetime trying to fill every awkward silence with reassurance, with comfort, with bridges I built alone, and I wasn't willing to do that anymore. "I want to come to your next exhibit," she said finally. "If you'll let me." And in that moment, I realized I had a decision to make, not about forgiveness, because forgiveness is something you give to yourself first, but about access, about who gets to step into the world I had rebuilt from the ashes of everything they'd once dismissed. I didn't give her an answer right away. Instead, I told her there would be one more show, and if she wanted to understand me, not the version of me she made peace with in her head, but the real, complicated, unapologetic woman I had become, then she needed to show up. No excuses. No conditions. That night, I began planning what would become the final exhibit in this quiet war I had been waging for most of my life. Not a battle of fists or screaming matches, but of colors, symbols, truths painted into permanence. It would be called Family Portraits That Never Hung, and it would feature everything I'd been too afraid to say when I was young, too scared to risk losing the little crumbs of approval I mistook for love. There would be no titles on the walls this time. Only images. Only truth. And if my mother wanted to stand in that room, surrounded by the emotional archaeology of a daughter she had never truly seen, then she would have to come alone. No explanations. No speeches. Just eyes open and finally, hopefully, ears ready to listen. There's a peculiar kind of stillness that comes in the days before a storm you know is inevitable, not the kind that stirs the sky into violence or sends people running for shelter, but the slower, quieter kind that hangs low in the air, heavy with pressure, thick with the knowing that something long buried is about to unearth itself, Inevitable, undeniable, and entirely out of your control. That's what the days before the final show felt like, not frantic or rushed like the first opening, not tense like the second confrontation, but oddly serene in that dreadful way that makes you question whether the peace you're feeling is real, or just the eye of something much darker that's been circling you for years. I had titled the final exhibit Family Portraits That Never Hung, and though I told myself it would be the last, that after this I would be free of the need to prove anything to anyone, I knew somewhere in the back of my mind, or maybe deeper in the hollow place where fear once lived, that this wasn't just a closing chapter, it was the moment that would decide whether or not I ever allowed any of them back into the gallery of my life. When the day came, the gallery was bare in a way I hadn't allowed it to be before, white walls devoid of decoration except for 6 massive canvases spaced deliberately, each one spotlighted with harsh, honest lighting, no color gels, no atmosphere-building filters, just raw illumination, the kind that reveals everything, even the brushstrokes you wish you could hide. There was no music playing, no champagne table, no sign-in sheet, and no speeches scheduled. I wanted them to walk in and feel what I had felt for most of my life, exposed, vulnerable, and yet strangely powerful in the bareness of truth. The first to arrive was Tasha, of course, with her steady presence and knowing look, the kind of person who understands what not to say better than most people know how to give advice. She hugged me tightly, not because I looked like I needed it, but because she understood that sometimes even those of us who finally find our voice still carry the ache of all the years we stayed quiet. She didn't ask who would come, she just walked the gallery in silence, pausing at each painting with a reverence that didn't need commentary. An hour passed, then another. A few familiar faces from past shows arrived, friends, supporters, one journalist who had been gently pestering me for a quote since the second exhibit, but I didn't speak much. I kept watching the door, not anxiously, but with a quiet, detached curiosity, wondering whether the people I had challenged to finally see me without their filters or excuses would actually dare to show up. Then, just as I turned to adjust one of the lights above the central piece, the door opened, and in walked my mother. She looked older than I remembered, not just in the physical sense, but in a way that suggested the weight of reflection had finally settled across her shoulders, replacing the stiff pride that used to keep her spine so perfectly straight. She didn't say anything at first, just stood there, clutching her purse like a shield, eyes darting across the room like she wasn't sure if she'd walked into an art gallery or an ambush. I didn't approach her. I let her come to me. She walked the space slowly, pausing at each piece, and I watched her face change with every painting she passed. There was the portrait of the little girl painting alone in a dark room while voices argued behind a closed door. There was the crumpled scholarship letter, half buried under an avalanche of unpaid bills and prescription bottles. There was the image of a birthday cake with no candles and a party hat lying on the floor. There was the silhouette of a woman screaming silently behind a frosted window. My mother's eyes glistened, and for once, she didn't hide it. She didn't wipe them away like she used to when emotion threatened to break through the surface she'd kept polished for so long. She let herself cry, just a little, and I let her. Then she looked at me, not with defiance, not with the condescending sadness of someone mourning their idea of me, but with something I had never seen in her eyes before: humility. She opened her mouth like she might say something, then closed it again, and finally just nodded, the kind of nod that says, "I don't have the words, but I know I owe you more than just an apology." I nodded back. That was enough for now. But the one who truly changed the course of that night wasn't my mother. It was Mark. I hadn't heard from my brother in almost 5 years beyond that one vague message after the first exhibit, and even then, it was nothing but a digital whisper, a ghost of a relationship long buried under decades of silence. But when he walked in that night, tall, leaner than I remembered, with shadows under his eyes and a box in his hands, everything in the room shifted. It wasn't dramatic or loud, but everyone in that gallery felt it. The air thickened, the noise faded, and I stood frozen, not in fear, but in something much deeper. Anticipation laced with history. He walked up to me without hesitation, without awkward small talk or pretense, and held the box out like it weighed more than it looked. I brought something, he said, and I recognized the box before I even touched it. It was our father's, a battered, old wooden thing with rusted hinges, something he'd kept locked away in his study, always saying it was full of stuff that didn't matter, yet refusing to throw it out. I took the box gently, set it on the pedestal behind me, and opened it. Inside were folders, old yellowed pages, a few half-finished sketches, and tucked between two pieces of cardboard, my own drawings. Not copies, not prints, but the originals I'd done as a child, drawings I thought had been tossed out, ignored, forgotten. There were notes in our father's handwriting, too, brief, gruff comments like, "She's got a real eye," and "This one made me stop." Nothing emotional or poetic, but for a man who never gave me so much as a full sentence of encouragement to my face, these words were thunderous. Mark cleared his throat, and for the first time in years, I heard his voice not as a stranger, but as my brother. He kept everything, he said, and there was no bitterness in his tone, only truth. He didn't know how to show it, but he believed in you. I felt something sharp and uninvited twist in my chest, and without realizing it, I sat down on the nearest bench, the weight of the box, the words, the years, pressing into me like a tide that had finally come back in. I didn't cry, not then, but I held one of the sketches to my chest, and for the first time in all these months, the silence wasn't heavy, it was healing. Mark sat beside me, not close, but close enough. "I should have been there," he said, and I knew he meant more than just the exhibits. I looked at him, studied the lines on his face, and asked the only question that mattered. "Do you want a painting?" He nodded. I went to the back, pulled a piece I hadn't shown anyone yet, and handed it to him. It was called Almost Forgiven. A bridge, half-built, reaching across a chasm toward a figure on the other side, barely visible but waiting. He looked at it for a long time, nodded again, and held it like it was made of glass. By the end of the night, the gallery was nearly empty. My mother was gone, having left quietly. Mark was still there, talking with Tasha, and I stood alone near the final canvas, the biggest one, a painting that showed a woman standing in a field of broken picture frames, arms outstretched, her shadow stretching far behind her. It didn't have a name. When someone finally asked what it was called, I smiled faintly and said, "That one's not for sale." And as the lights dimmed, the doors locked, and the silence returned, I thought about everything I had lost in the name of family, and everything I had gained in the absence of their approval. I thought about the speeches, the faces, the betrayals, and the messages soaked in guilt. And I knew, with the kind of certainty that doesn't come often, that I didn't need to make peace with everyone. I only needed to make peace with myself. To those who couldn't be bothered, I whispered as I turned off the final light, "Thank you." Because in the end, their absence made room for something far more beautiful than their presence ever could.